Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Well, one thing which I get asked about a lot is the present perfect. Usually during lessons, when I ask people what's the difference between I washed the car and I have washed the car, there's a kind of a silence, and people say, well, you know, I washed the car means it's finished. I have washed the car, it's still going. And I'm saying, no, really, no, that's not the difference, and that's incorrect. Both actions are finished, so why do we need two different ones? And then there's usually another silence, and the person looks at me and says, oh, I don't know. I don't know. So in this podcast, I want to explain why we have the present perfect. It's actually very simple. So let me explain. So the best way to think of the past tense, I washed the car, is think of it like a big library, a big archive. And imagine that archive has time and date, okay, about events that happened. There's no emotion to them. They're just tagged with a time and date. And even if the sentence doesn't contain the time and date, it's still in the archive. I washed the car. We're not saying when we washed it, but it's washed. There was a moment in time, so it has a time and date. It was washed. That's it. That's the past tense. The present perfect, on the other hand, is outside of time. It's about the action of doing. So, the question about the past tense, just before we move on to the present perfect, what did you do at 3 o'clock on Friday? I washed the car. What were you doing 5 minutes ago? I washed the car. But the present perfect is not a tense of time. It doesn't have time in it. It's the language of poets, of artists, of feeling, of emotion. And that's why it needs to be used. For example, if I say I love you, okay, in the present tense, it sounds kind of eternal, doesn't it? But you'd never hear anyone saying, well, I loved you, but I don't anymore. Well, maybe some people do that, but if they do, they're not grasping the deeper concept of love, are they? Which is eternal and going on and on and on forever and ever. So, I have done something is nothing to do with when something was done, but it's got everything to do with the action of doing. Okay. So in the case of washing the car, I have washed the car. It's saying, well, it's answering the question, what have you been doing? Which is timeless. Okay. It's also outside of time, because the question, what have you been doing, has got nothing to do with time. It's asking about action. Imagine you go up with your friends one day. You all go to this lovely coffee shop and you have delicious pastries and donuts and everything. And while you're sitting there, your friend says, oh, how have you been? And you say, well, on Monday I walked the dogs. On Tuesday I won the best award at work. On Wednesday I went to the park. On Thursday I finished my project. You would know there's something wrong there, because you're giving a list of achievements, of times of those achievements. You're not actually saying in a natural way how you feel or what you have been doing. So the clear answer would be to say things like, oh, I've been busy. I've been walking the dog. I have finished a project. So you see, it's much more smooth. Let me give you another example of that, okay? So imagine you're sick. The next day, you go back to work, and your boss says, where were you yesterday? He's asking about yesterday because he only cares about putting that on his Excel spreadsheet. He doesn't actually care about how your health is. So you say, oh, I was sick. And he says, oh, okay. And he goes to his Excel spreadsheet, puts an X in the box to show you were sick, and everything's fine. But if your mother asks you, where were you yesterday? And you say, oh, I was sick, she doesn't care about time. She's going to ask all kinds of questions outside of time to find out exactly how you are. So she's going to be saying things like, oh, you've been sick. And how have you been since then? Is everything okay? So the present perfect is always the language of emotion. The past tense is always the language of time. You go to work one day, your boss says, how was your weekend? He's only asking about times and dates, so he's really saying there, what things did you do? So our response would be, oh, I went to the park with the kids on Saturday. It rained yesterday. But if you were talking to someone that really cared, and I'm sure some bosses do, he wouldn't ask that. He would say, hey, how has your weekend been? And you can say something like, oh, my weekend's been fine. I've been busy with the children. And in this case, you're talking outside of time. And when you talk outside of time, it's a much deeper kind of response. It's much more personal because he's asking about the actions that you've been doing because he cares. He's not asking about the times of those actions, you know. In business English, the past tense is usually used more, but that's just a brief introduction. And if you're not sure what to use and when, it takes a little bit of practice because they don't use the present perfect in American English. That's why British people always think that they're very rude, you know. But if you're not sure which one to use, there is a booklet. I'll put the link in the show notes. It's just a 10-page booklet, or if you're listening to this on italki, just send me a short message asking for it and I'll send it to you, which goes over some examples. All right, so I hope you've found this very, very useful, or you can just go to teacherjoseph.com and download it. It's on my website. That might be the easiest way. And that, my friends, is the present perfect. So, see you. Bye.